And we're back. Today we're going to discuss the image trace and live trace options in Adobe Illustrator. Those two options may sound similar, and they very well are. They essentially get the same job done. They just go about it slightly differently. Live trace was used in the previous versions of Adobe Illustrator, and the more current versions use image trace. That's essentially the big difference, other than how they look and the way they go about doing things, but they still get the same result. A lot of people may have found live tracing a little more confusing than image tracing, but we'll explain both. We will give you a live preview of the image trace option, and then we'll discuss the live trace options. So let's go. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab an image. We need an image because the tracing tool, essentially it takes a bitmap image, which is a regular picture that's made up of pixels, and it transforms that into a vector image that can be scaled. What you do is you take an image. You can get your image from anywhere. I got this image from Google. I am not sure where this image exactly may have originated in its entirety, and I'm not using it for any other purpose other than to show this example. And you place it on your artboard. Now, once you have it on your artboard, you want to click the image. Once you've clicked it, you'll notice the image highlights, but you'll also notice in your panel, right above your artboard, that all of your options change. So once you click it, you get an option that says image trace. And if you highlight and hover over it, it says converts image into tracing object. Now, what you do is you would essentially click this button and it would change it into a traced object. But there are some default options if you were interested in starting off with some default options. So if you were to click the arrow that's right next to your trace button, you're going to see some options here. And you can select any of these depending upon the look and style you want for your traced image. So let's say we want sketched art. We would click this and we would wait for it to render. Now I may skip through some of this because the render times may take a little while. Essentially your computer is generating a ton of lines for the artwork that it's making. Now if you look, mine came out as a black and white traced image, even though it has sketched art. Now what if I wanted that to be a colored image? How can I adjust these options? Well, if you look in your panel again to the top, under the image tracing options, you'll notice there's a preset. And right now it's showing you what your preset is that you selected. But if you wanted more options, you can click this panel, which is your image trace panel. And once you click that, it brings up the full image trace panel. And inside this panel, you have quite a lot of options. So let's go through them, starting in the main area, and we'll just go through them briefly. This first part where it says preset is essentially what you first selected. So you can shift and change the type of preset that you want. Underneath view, you have options to view your type of result. You can view the tracing result, which is what we're looking at now. You can view it with the outlines. If you notice, the blue are the outlines of the actual tracing result. You can view just the outlines itself, outlines with the original image, and or just the original image itself. So let's go back to our tracing result. Now right now it's in black and white mode, which is why you will see this image like this. If you wanted to see it in color, you would just have to click this mode option and select color. Because of the time, again, I may skip through parts of the rendering process so that we get there faster. And it's done. And you'll notice now it looks way more close to the original than it did previously. Now we have color options. If you were to go to your view options in that drop-down box, and you were to click tracing result with outlines, unlike before where you only saw a few, you'll now see a bunch of outlines. Now each one of these outlines indicates a path or a shape that indicates a different color that was used in that area. and it separates them each out, so that way it builds it like a topographical map. This is how the outlines look by themselves and with the original source image. And you can turn that on or off just to see the source image versus what you're currently looking at, just as a quick view. So you see it's pretty close. But you can also change how close you want to get that. Now with sketched art, which is what we're working with or working off of, it gives you a limited palette. Now right now with a limited palette, you only have a set amount of colors that you can work with. We got 2 through 30. Now if we were to go to full tone, we have an option that's based off of percentage. And if you hover over it, and this is something I'm going to tell you to do, just so that you're familiar with what these options do. When you hover over some of the options, they will actually tell you exactly what the meaning is. In previous versions, it was a little more difficult. You had to kind of play the guessing game and figure it out on your own. But you can actually hover over these options now, and the explanations they give are much more detailed. Now, we're done. It's just rendered with 100% accuracy on our color panel. Now, if you remember what our previous version looked like, we could see huge shapes through our outlines. And each one of those were stacked up to give us more of a form. But now that we've added more color accuracy, it's probably, not probably, but it is making those shapes even smaller and stacking them more and more together so that they almost look non-existent. If you compare this to the original, it's very, very close. Now, let's look at our tracing results with the outlines. And now you'll see how many there are compared to how many there were before. So let's just look at the outlines itself, and let's click to see what our original image looked like on those outlines. You see? And you can do this for any option that you have in the palette menu. You can change it to full tone, limited, or automatic. Just remember, limited is going to set you for a significantly less, less detailed color palette. So you're going to have way less numbers to work with. So you may only be given a certain amount, like we were given 30 in our color panel. Okay? Now, in your advanced option, we're going to turn this back to our tracing result. You have, let's hover over them so that way you can see. It says path fitting higher value means tighter fit. In other words, those outlines that you saw, this governs the accuracy of the actual outlines themselves. So the higher the number, the tighter the fit is going to be between those paths, leaving less space for gaps. And if you look at the bottom, you'll notice you have paths, anchors, and colors. And I'm going to boost this because it says higher value means tighter fit, which essentially means it's going to be a better look. We're going to move this up to a higher accuracy, and we're going to see how these change in our bottom. So we're going to click this and slide it all the way up. And remember, our paths were at 16,291. Once it's rendered, we're going to see how much that changes. And we're done. Now, it's even tighter in terms of the path. It may be a little more difficult to see, but what it has done is added more paths. Remember previously it was 16,291 paths. Now we're at 16,319, so it's added a few more paths to make it a tighter fit in between our colors. Now, our corners option is actually going to emphasize whether or not we have more or less corners in our tracing object. So the higher the number, the more corners, and the less corners. Right now we have it at 100%. With our 100%, it shows us that it actually decreases the number of anchors. And the reason it's doing that is because there are less need for anchors around these curves. If you want something that is, in my opinion, easier to edit with accuracy, you want less anchor points. A lot of people think that the more anchors you have, the more accurate it is. It isn't true. Actually, it makes it more difficult because then you have to move and manipulate more of these anchor points. When you have a circle, it is easier to have a point or an anchor point at a north, south, east, and west section of your circle, maybe 4 anchor points, each with a curve. But if you have an anchor point for every degree in the circles, and that means you have 360 anchor points, not only is it going to be tedious, it's going to be highly inaccurate because you're going to have to make sure that each one is corresponding to its next anchor point or the adjacent anchor point so that it looks like the shape you're trying to get. Whereas having less allows you to manipulate the curve and or the anchor point when it comes down to it so there's more accuracy. Now, our next option is the noise option. If we were to hover over the noise option, it's going to tell us that it reduces noise by ignoring areas of specific pixel size. And the higher value means the less noise. So the less noise there is, it just means that it's ignoring more areas of a specific pixel size. So if you look here, 20 pixels, right? It means anything of 20 pixels, that's how much is being ignored. Anything 20 pixels and larger. Anything 100 and larger is being ignored. And that gives you less noise. And we're done. You'll also notice that now we have way more anchors and paths than we did previously. That means it's permitting more of the actual paths to be created as long as they're under 100 pixels. Prior, it was any path can be recreated if it was under 20 pixels. So now we have way more paths and anchors that have been created due to this option going up. Now if we move down to the method area, it tells us to choose a tracing method. As we are currently selecting this, it has create cutout paths. Essentially, cutout paths mean that one path clips another, and that's essentially what it is. Think of it like a puzzle piece. And you can see we're right here, the shape shows that there are cutouts from that actual path when it's moved. But if we click overlapping, it essentially means the paths are stacked on top of each other. So it will recreate an entire tracing depending upon what you've selected. So right now, let's take our option and we're going to move this option here. And then we are going to duplicate it and we're going to put another one right by its side. And we're going to do 2 different methods. So we're going to choose overlapping for this one. Now, our images pretty much look identical, right? But if we select one versus the other, you'll notice this has a different path, anchors, and color value than this one. This has more, this has less. And the reason why is because one is a cutout method versus the other, which is not. Now, if we were to keep going down, we'll notice that we have a create button and we have a stroke button. But right now they aren't highlighted. And the reason why is because we have our current color mode set to color. If we were to change this to black and white, these options would become available. And essentially what they do is they allow you to pick in a black and white image whether or not we're creating just fills or just strokes or both fills and strokes. And then under our stroke option, it allows you to set the width in pixels that the trace dialog box will recognize before it actually changes that to a stroke. Okay? But let's skip that for a second and we'll go to the options. Right now we have an option that says snap curves to lines. And it takes smaller size curves, which you may not see in this, and then it will actually snap them straight into a straight line. So it takes small Bezier curves that might look like, let's say this, and in essence this is what it's doing. Alright, so it's changing small curves to straight line. Now, if we were to highlight our image again, go back into our image trace options, we notice that there's another option that called for ignore white. If we were to select the option that calls for ignore white, it essentially tells us in black and white images or certain images that give you a white option, mainly black and white, it will remove the white from the image. So it doesn't actually set it as a swatch color. It'll just leave it as a transparent or see-through color or a no fill. And you know, once you click something and you make a no fill, the shape itself will still be there. There will be no stroke, but there will be no fill either. It'll be the shape itself. You can always then change the color later, but it will show as non-existent. And that's essentially what the ignore white option does. It gets rid of all the white that would be in the image. So let's change the color mode here. And you'll notice this option for colors, since it's no longer in the color mode, will change. So we go to black and white, and now we have a threshold. Alright, and threshold essentially, as I said before, hover over these if you need to find out what the definition is. It says pixels darker than threshold value are actually converted to black. So anything that, your threshold is a limiter. So let's say if 50 was our threshold. Anything above 50 or anything below would go on either end of the spectrum. And when you look at this, it tells you that these values that are darker than the threshold are converted to black. So if anything is actually darker than that threshold, less than that threshold, it's going to be converted to complete black. All right? So anything else, of course, would be converted to white. So it's just telling you what it's going to gauge as what part of the image it's going to turn white versus black. Let's look closer into this portion of the hair, because there are some gradations there we may get some differences in. And we are going to click our preview button, make sure that's on. We're going to watch this change to a black and white image. Now notice all of this actually changed to a black and white image. Now let's increase this and bump it all the way up on our threshold. Now our whole image is just black. And you can tell by the look in the transparency panel. But if we were to scroll and take this all the way down, like not all the way, let's say we go to 31. You'll notice now there are certain areas in the hair that are still left white or without a black fill. Now let's bump this from 30, let's go to 100. And let's keep in mind the areas that were left blank. And actually we're on 99 because I couldn't drag it to 100. But now you notice that it went exactly to where that fill area was. It turned back to black. And you can change these values by your up and down arrow keys. And you can use your actual mouse to click and drag the cursor. Or you can just highlight the number and change the actual value that's within here. And you'll notice once you clear out of the box or tab out of the box, it will change the amount on your screen. So that's what the threshold value does. Let's go back to like 75. Now, everything about this is the same. You still have your paths, you still have your corners, and you still have your noise. Your method is the same, except now you have the create options box that's open, and you can select to not create fills and just create strokes. And when you do that, now you'll notice that it changed everything to strokes. And the reason it looks like this and looks all weird is that it'll take the maximum width that's set here in terms of pixels, and whatever that width is, that's what it's going to recognize as a shape and or a fill that can be converted to a stroke. Okay, so we can actually select both at the same time. We can have fills and strokes, or we can just have strokes, or we can just have fills. Now, let's take the stroke option off just to get the image basic again. Now, looking up, after all is said and done, you'll notice at the very, very top, you have a few options. All right. All of these options essentially govern how this is going to color your image. So we're going to change this. Let's actually go to a preset, let's say 16 colors. We'll click that and we'll wait for it to render. Now that we have it set at a color mode, let's go and look at what these options are going to give us. Let's click auto color. When you click auto color, it automatically shifts to what it governs as the best color correcting option for the image itself. Our other options in this image, and get rid of that real quick. If we select it, we'll notice that we have high color, low color, grayscale, black and white, and outline. High color essentially is more photorealistic. It gives you the max, basically high fidelity photo color option. It's just like going in here and selecting high fidelity photo. This is like selecting low fidelity photo. This is grayscale, shades of gray. This is black and white logo. And this is just our outline. Or let's click it and show you what that looks like, which is essentially just giving us the stroke options that we had before. Okay, so all of these options are here. They're very relatively self-explanatory and they're simple to go through. But the only thing you need to remember after you've done this and you've selected what you want to do, let's go back to auto color. Now that we're back in auto color, you'll notice that if we wanted to select any of these colors, we can't do so. We still have our big X across our image showing that it was a placed image. We have to expand this image first in order for this to work. So you select the image and you click the expand button that's in your upper panel. And once you do that, you'll notice now you have editable paths. You can click, you can delete, you can select certain paths, and let's say you want to recolor them, you can repurpose them for another color. Whatever the case is, you now have these and you can edit them with your different tools. You can delete anchor points, you can create new ones, whatever you want to do. Now it's editable. But that's how you use the actual image trace option in Adobe Illustrator. The next thing we're going to discuss in our next video is going to be a brief run through of what the live trace options were in previous versions of, or the previous set of live trace options in Adobe Illustrator. Okay, so if you need to look at that, take a look. We're not going to run through how each option works. Essentially, they work very similar to this, but it just looks a little bit different. So we'll run through what they mean and what the panel will look like. Okay, so I'll see you guys there.